So we have arrived to the last session of our day. As usual, the presentation of the speakers is short. Our first speaker will be Mark Redfield from the Comparative Literature and English Department, and chair of the Comparative Literature Department, author of Phantom Formation, Aesthetic Ideology and the Bildungsroman, The Politics of Aesthetics, Nationalism, Gender and Romanticism, and more recently, Rhetoric of Terror, Reflections on 9/11 and on the War of Terror. And another book, I guess, coming soon. It's out. It's out. Oh, sorry. So I'll read it. So the web page is not... So the last book is the book on Theory at Yale, The Strange Case of Deconstruction in America. And Mark will speak about Shibolet. I'm saying it as it should be said. Or Sibolet, of course. This is the whole trick. Sibolet or Shibolet. Our second speaker will be Vazira Fasila Yakubali Zamindar. I hope I pronounce it correctly. From the Department of History, a historian of modern South Asia, and a co-director of the South Asian Studies Program, and author of The Long Partition and the Making of Modern South Asia, Refugees, Boundaries, Histories. I guess there is more to be updated, but I looked at an old website. And she will speak about minority. So, Shibolet.
Thank you. And thanks to Adi, Bonnie, Tim, Amanda, the Kogut Center, and to everyone who's here at this late hour. This is sketchy new work, so it is not part of a much longer document. So we'll see, although it is connected to one or two other things that I've done. The word shibboleth, which I'm going to pronounce that way, appears rarely but memorably in the Hebrew Bible. In Judges 12, the Gileadites, that's how you pronounce it, having defeated a traditional enemy of Israel, the Ammonites, faced danger from close relatives, the Ephraimites, who live on the other side of the Jordan. At least I think they do. I could use one of those 19th century sacred geographers that Branko was referring to. Before recalling that famous encounter, let me briefly sketch its context. Since the defeat of the Ammonites had already involved the Gileadites in the resolution and repetition of internecine violence. Threatened by the Ammonites, the Gileadites call on Jephthah, a mighty man of valor, to lead them. The problem is that Jephthah, an illegitimate son of Gilead, had previously been expelled from the land by Gilead's wife's sons, who didn't want him to share in their patrimony, for thou art the son of a strange woman. The repentant Gileadites, under threat from the Ammonites, vow unto the Lord that they will make Jephthah their head if he will lead them as their war captain, and Jephthah agrees. He then vows unto the Lord that if the Lord allows him to defeat the Ammonites, he will offer up as a burnt offering, quote, whatsoever cometh forth of the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace. If you're familiar with mythic narrative, you know what a bad idea it is to make that sort of oath. Jephthah defeats the Ammonites, and of course what comes forth out of the doors of his house is his own daughter. The daughter unnamed in the story, there's a sense in which she does not live long enough for a name, begs for 2 months to bewail her virginity, which are accorded her, after which the father, quote, did with her according to his vow, which he had vowed. Hard on the heels of this blood sacrifice, this grim counterpoint to the Abraham and Isaac story, the Ephraimites enter Gilead, angry that Jephthah has fought and presumably despoiled the Ammonites without them, and there follows the blood-soaked story of the Shibboleth. And so this is the passage in the King James translation. And the men of Ephraim gathered themselves together and went northward and said unto Jephthah, Wherefore passest thou over to fight against the children of Ammon, and didst not call us to go with thee? We will burn thine house upon thee with fire. And Jephthah said unto them, I and my people were at great strife with the children of Ammon. And when I called you, ye delivered me not out of their hands. And when I saw that ye delivered me not, I put my life in my hands and passed over against the children of Ammon. And the Lord delivered them into my hand. Wherefore then are ye come upon me this day to fight against me? Then Jephthah gathered together all the men of Gilead and fought with Ephraim. And the men of Gilead smote Ephraim, because they said, that is, the Ephraimites said, Ye Gileadites are fugitives of Ephraim among the Ephraimites and among the Manassites. And the Gileadites took the passages of Jordan before the Ephraimites. And it was so that when those Ephraimites which were escaped said, Let me go over, that the men of Gilead said unto him, Art thou an Ephraimite? If he said, Nay, then said they unto him, Say now, Shibboleth. And he said, Sibboleth, for he could not frame to pronounce it right. Then they took him and slew him at the passages of Jordan, and there fell at that time of the Ephraimites 42,000. Out of this episode evolved the word shibboleth as we use it today. In Hebrew, it means either stream or ear of corn, and a cognate in Arabic means flowing rain. And I thank my friend Saul Oilian for confirming this. But in modern European, or for that matter, non-European languages, in all languages, is my claim anyway, including, I presume, in Hebrew and Arabic, it also means the shibboleth test and extensions of that meaning. The extensions carry the signification of this word beyond linguistic testing and even beyond testing in the strict sense. The entry shibboleth in the Oxford English Dictionary, stripped of its examples, reads thus. 1, the Hebrew word used by Jephthah, in trouble with that name, as a test word to distinguish the fleeing Ephraimites who could not pronounce the SH from his own men, the Gileadites. There are many things to say about this, this word, and among them is the peculiarity that the first definition of it in this dictionary, in any case, is the word itself. 2, a word or sound which a person is unable to pronounce correctly, a word used as a test for detecting foreigners or persons from another district by their pronunciation. B, a peculiarity of pronunciation or accent indicative of a person's origin. Or C, loosely, a custom, habit, mode of dress, or the like, which distinguishes a particular class or set of persons. And then 3, figurative, A, catchword or formula adopted by a party or sect, by which their adherents or followers may be discerned, or those not their followers may be excluded, and B, the mode of speech distinctive of a profession, class, etc. We can expect to find broadly similar entries in the dictionary of other modern languages, potentially, if not actually, I would suggest in any language now in use in the world. If, like myself, you don't speak or read Hebrew or Arabic, you might be thinking that you don't pronounce this word as a native speaker. But in fact you do, no matter what language you speak, for this word has migrated, or at the very least stands ready to migrate, across any given linguistic border. Whoever you are a Gileadite of sorts, competent to speak this word, which means that it is now practically useless as a shibboleth test. Not utterly useless, because no word is that. An American or a Briton might betray an accent, uttering even this one word at a French border, for instance, and vice versa. There will always be better tests, however, and a good one will be chosen with a particular enemy in mind. For this is the first peculiarity I would like to underscore about the shibboleth. Its policing power implies a certain intimacy, the sharing, the partage, that nice French word that both means separation and sharing, of a border, the sharing of a border. You have to know that the other can't pronounce the word, can't reproduce the sign or signature, won't know, or is likely not to know the bit of cultural trivia being requested, and so on. And you also have to be in a situation where, in the absence of a shibboleth test, you might mistake the other for the self, the enemy for the friend. That lesson descends to us from the biblical story. Both the Gileadites and the Ephraimites are descendants of Joseph and Asenath. And the laconic narrative of Judges 12 suggests that the mass murder of the latter by the former is triggered by the Ephraimites insisting that the Gileadites are in fact Ephraimites. Quote, "And the men of Gilead smote Ephraim, because they said, Ye Gileadites are fugitives of Ephraim among the Ephraimites and among the Manassites." They have the same ancestors and they speak the same language. But unluckily for the Ephraimites, there is a linguistic difference cutting its thin, deadly way through words that mobilize a certain phoneme, slicing these descendants of Joseph into two separable linguistic communities. It is a slender difference, not always or easily perceptible, since a special test is required to bring it into focus. But in the right context, it becomes a knife blade. It cuts because it mobilizes a non-semantic difference. One has to be able to do the shibboleth, as Jacques Derrida remarks at one point in his long, sensitive meditation on the word and figure shibboleth in the poetry of Paul Celan. The Ephraimites presumably knew perfectly well how they ought to be pronouncing the word they were being asked to pronounce. They just could not do it. The shibboleth testifies to, quote, "the inscription of difference in the body," as Derrida puts it. It is unpronounceable by, quote, "one who does not partake of the covenant or alliance." As the sign of a wholly non-natural yet unchosen border, the shibboleth opens the very possibility of the political in Carl Schmitt's sense as the distinction of friend and enemy. Yet, as a closer look will show, it also undermines or complicates that distinction. We can isolate two seemingly opposed presuppositions that go into the making of the concept, if it is one, of the shibboleth as it emerges in this biblical story. First, on the one hand, it presupposes a degree of similarity, a certain fraternity or intimacy between the players on both sides of the difference it polices. The shibboleth is a technology of detection, a supplement to ordinary discourse made necessary because the potential infiltrator, or in the biblical story, the potential escapee, is a neighbor, looks and sounds like a native, speaks the language almost perfectly, knows almost all the codes circulating in the community that the shibboleth is erected to protect. The other is practically the self, and the violence unleashed by the shibboleth responds to the intolerable proximity of the other, the uninsurability of the difference between self and other. The Ephraimites must not be allowed to flee back to their home. They must be rubbed out rather than being let out, because they infiltrate, double, and threaten to claim the self. Only the shibboleth holds them at bay long enough to be annihilated. So on the one hand, the shibboleth presupposes similarity, but on the other hand, this is my second point, it presupposes decisive difference. It presupposes Babel, as in the Tower of Babel, the fundamental plurality of languages and communities. And in fact, the shibboleth may be read as the mark and testimony of the essential plurality within a language, as the signature of difference and plurality that inhabits and informs and is language, language that is not and can never be one. The shibboleth emerges precisely where language seems one, where the other speaks almost like the self, yet it fractures that seeming and makes visible that almost. This also means, however, that despite its murderous power as a technique of detection and discrimination, 42,000 Ephraimites killed, despite that, it is not an entirely reliable tool. The cutting and splicing it performs points to cuts and splits within the body of the community it polices. That, at least, is how I propose to interpret the internecine rhythm of expulsion, return, and sacrifice that characterizes the story of Jephthah and the Gileadites prior to their battle with the Ephraimites. The shibboleth cuts with the same fatality that marks Jephthah as illegitimate and his daughter as the requisite burnt offering. The community is not one, and its oaths unto the Lord cut both ways, bringing Jephthah home to the father at the cost of maiming the father's household elsewhere. There's a further way in which the shibboleth is not an entirely reliable tool of political power. Precisely because language is not one, but is marked by difference and differs from itself, the singular performance submits to iterability. You cannot choose to perform the shibboleth successfully, but you also cannot insulate the shibboleth from a repetition that would escape notice, precisely because phonemic differences are unwilled, unchosen, and, as shibboleths, only contingently mobilizable for political programs. It is always possible that an Ephraimite who had a Gileadic nanny or is an exceptional mimic will pass unscathed through the linguistic guillotine. Shibboleth cuts are in this sense like the cords of a net, which functions only by being full of holes. The cuts are everywhere. Think of the fine shades of accent and dialect, idiom and idiolect that make up linguistic communities, even in societies as mass-mediated as the 21st century United States, and in earlier periods these differences were arguably more audible. They are coercive, those differences, but they can always possibly be imitated successfully. Mark Twain famously claims to mimic a variety of vanished local forms of speech in Huckleberry Finn. It's a famous author's note that precedes the novel. In this book, a number of dialects are used, to wit, the Missouri Negro dialect, the extremist form of the backwoods southwestern dialect, the ordinary Pike County dialect, and 4 modified varieties of this last. The shadings have not been done in a haphazard fashion or by guesswork, but painstakingly, and with the trustworthy guidance and support of personal familiarity with these several forms of speech. I make this explanation for the reason that without it, many readers would suppose that all these characters were trying to talk alike and not succeeding. Twain at least claims to be able to mimic, at least in writing, speech patterns that mark out differences and hierarchies of race, class, and locality in a patch of 19th century America. As Derrida comments, quote, "The violence of an injustice has begun when all the members of a community do not share through and through the same idiom. Yet this web of differences can never function seamlessly. Language is structurally open to the other. For that reason, fiercely patrolled communities and ideologies have reason to seek out non-linguistic tokens of belonging." In the rest of this paper, I shall discuss a couple of instances of this in 19th and early 20th century European anti-Semitic writing. Though I don't wish to claim exemplary status for this archive, it just happens to be one in which I have some access as a scholar. It does, however, there is an advantage to this, it allows us to examine texts that are instructively hysterical in their engagement with the promises and perils of a linguistic shibboleth. I shall look briefly at passages in 2 classics of 19th century racism, Richard Wagner's Das Judentum in der Musik, Jewishness in Music from 1850, and Arthur de Gobineau's De l'inégalité des races humaines, Inequality of Human Races, 1853. And I'll close with looking at an interestingly peculiar passage in a particularly unpleasant text by Carl Schmitt, Staat, Bewegung, Volk, State, Movement, People, published in 1935. So not just any year. Wagner grounds his diatribe against Jewish music in a claim that activates a topic in racial anti-Semitic writing, that the Jew has no proper language. So, quote, "The Jew speaks the language of the nation in which he dwells from generation to generation, but he speaks it always as an alien. In the first place, then, the general circumstance that the Jew speaks the modern European languages merely as learnt and not as mother tongues, tongue into which you are born, must necessarily debar him from all capacity of expressing himself idiomatically, independently, and conformably to his nature. A language with its expression, its evolution, is not the work of scattered units, but of a historical community. Only he who has unconsciously grown up within the bond of this community takes also any share of its creations. But the Jew has stood outside the pale of any such community, along with his Jehovah, in a splintered, soilless stock, to which all development out of itself remains denied, just as the peculiar Hebraic language of that stock has been preserved for him merely as a dead language. The parenthetical Hebraic is Wagner. I didn't put that in. Thus, European art and civilization have remained for the Jew a foreign language, fremde Sprache. And one more quote. In this speech, this art, or in this speech or this art, the Jew can only repeat, imitate, not truly poeticize in speech or create artworks, end quote. Wagner goes on to insist that this act of repetition and imitation is always audible, exposed by the physical body that instantiates the Jew's racial identity. And this is Wagner again. This is on the slide. Is that right? Yeah. Throughout an intercourse of 2 millennia with European nations, culture has not succeeded in breaking the remarkable stubbornness of the Jewish disposition as regards the peculiarities of Semitic pronunciation. The first thing that strikes our ear as thoroughly foreign and unpleasant is a hissing, shrilling, buzzing, and blundering expression of sound in the Jew's way of speaking. And I have the German there just because Wagner's sort of ironically imitating it. Add thereto an employment of words in a sense quite foreign to our nation's tongue and an arbitrary twisting of the structure of our phrases, and this mode of speaking acquires at once the character of an intolerably jumbled blabber. Not pleasant reading this, but the hysterical pitch of Wagner's writing suggests how insecure, fantastic, and fragile the fantasy of racial identity is as the guarantor of the linguistic shibboleth. And the version of this topic, this topos that you have in Gobineau, is less rhetorically violent than Wagner's, but Gobineau invests even more heavily in the notion that the Jew has no proper language, not even Hebrew. For, he claims, the Jews borrowed, quote, the Canaanitish tongue that, quote, in their mouth became a special dialect of the very ancient language which was the mother of the earliest Arabic we know. And now here's quote from Gobineau. In their everyday life, however, the Jews used the tongue of the country where they settled, and further, these exiles were known everywhere by their special accent. They never succeeded in fitting their vocal organs to their adopted language, even when they had learned it from childhood. I put the French in because I realized that I was using a very bad translation in English. It's the opposite, right? Language they learned since the cradle did not succeed in making their vocal organ more supple, is the literal translation. This goes to confirm what Wilhelm von Humboldt says as to the connection between race and language being so close that later generations never get quite accustomed to pronounce correctly words that were unknown to their ancestors. And then finally, we encounter a more conflicted and interesting version of this at the end of Carl Schmitt's short treatise, State Movement People. Published in 1935, but written a little earlier, this text is Schmitt's profession of faith in the new National Socialist regime. In it, he recants his earlier affirmation of statism in order to affirm the fundamental role of the party and the movement, which is the feature Schmitt observes that distinguishes Nazism from Italian fascism. In the present context, we can ignore the substance of this text and just leap to its closing sentences. This is my last long quotation. We're doing all right on time. Montesquieu's famous saying that the judge is only the mouth that utters the words of the law, la bouche qui prononce les paroles de la loi, was in the 18th century mostly construed in a mechanical way. For our present-day sensibility, this saying already leads to the sphere of the living human being, filled with organic, biological, and ethnic differences. Today, we have come more receptive. We see even the diversity of the mouths, if I may say so, which utter the ostensibly same words and sentences. And here, there's not a translation problem. It's just I'm verifying that this weird sentence is exactly the same, really, in German. You see the mouths. We hear how these same words are pronounced very differently. We know that the same vocable in the mouths of different people not only sounds differently, but also means something else in thought and fact. We seek a commitment which is deeper, more reliable, and more imbued with life than the deceptive attachment to the distorted letter of thousands of paragraphs of the law. Where else can it rest but in ourselves and in our kin? The exigency of an ethnic identity without which a total leader state could not stand its ground a single day. Those are the very last words of the treatise. The Jew is not named here, but Schmidt leaves no doubt. The different people, whose German is not really German, are the people of the dead letter of the law, the abject other of the folk imbued with life, quote unquote. Intriguingly, though, Schmidt seems to be teasing himself with the possibility that this difference is actually inaudible. Hence the strained figure of seeing the, quote, diversity of the mouths, which utter the ostensibly same words and sentences. Hence the inverted commas around pronounced in we hear how these same words are pronounced very differently. And it's the same in German. Wir hören, wie sie dieselben Worte sehr verschieden aussprechen. For indeed, when the Jewish native speaker of German speaks, what German ear is going to be able reliably to hear this shibboleth? The unreliability of the linguistic shibboleth is what drove 19th century racism to invoke the body so violently and implausibly as a determination of language. Schmidt, an interesting writer even at his ideological worst, is willing to dwell a little longer with uncertainty. The final sentence of this treatise is truly remarkable. Without ethnic identity, Artgleichheit, Schmidt says, the leader state, Führerstaat, could not stand a single day. This is an exposed and endangered Führerstaat. And ethnic identity here is nothing less than the catechon, that which withholds, that which delays the apocalypse. You remember the catechon, that strange figure of Paul's from Thessalonians that our dear friend Peter Zendi discussed with us last spring. One sees why Schmidt very soon ran into trouble with the regime. Dreaming of an accent beyond accent, a shibboleth beyond and deeper and more visible than phonemes, Schmidt gives the racial logic of bodily identity a disorienting extra twist. At stake is the naturalness of the difference, a naturalness that here becomes shadowed by its own finitude and becomes a catechon, holding thought back from the recognition that, quote, from Derrida, the inscription of difference in the body, as Derrida puts it, is precisely, quote, not natural, in no way an organic faculty. That recognition may be said to be the recognition of the shibboleth as a political concept. Writing and policing borders, the shibboleth also opens their unraveling and rewriting, and it is here that Derrida, reading Celan, cautiously affirms a promise of hospitality flickering in, of all places, the shibboleth. And I quote Derrida, quote, to the stranger, to the other, to the neighbor, to the guest, to whomever, that promise of hospitality. As a parting gesture, as a palate cleanser after all that Wagner and Gobineau and Schmidt, let me show you a couple of images of the famous installation Shibboleth by the Colombian artist Doris Salcedo in the Turbine Hall of the Tate Modern in London in 2007-2008. This work, apparently the first literally to crack open the architecture of a major museum, was, as you can see, a jagged fissure 500 feet long in the floor of the enormous hall, running from a hairline crack to a gap a bit less than a foot wide. The sides of the cleft were polished and reinforced with wire netting, stressing the non-naturalness of the crack. Its bottom was never completely visible. People interacted energetically with it. and sometimes got bruised, according to a New York Times article titled "Caution, Art Afoot." Halfway through its tenure, the installation's tenure, 15 people had, quote, suffered minor injuries, tripping and hurting themselves. At the end of the period of time assigned to the installation, in April 2008, the work was filled in or buried, reverse buried, you could say. A faint brownish scar remains on the floor of the turbine hall. It's easy enough to name some of the major themes associable with this work, and the reviews that I've looked at, which sometimes quote Salcedo herself or refer to her distinguished history of political art making, note how this installation wounds the ground, the foundation of the museum, evokes division, brokenness, and pain, allows savvy museum goers who know Salcedo's other work to speculate about the damage done by colonialism, racism, imperialism, capitalism. Fair enough. But what led Salcedo to call this work shibboleth? A word that means the meaningless cut of a word, of that very word, shibboleth, singular yet ungovernably multiple, a word that names a sovereign act of power while cutting the ground away from the sovereign claim to know what is being performed. The hinge story of a mass murder at a border, yet nonetheless also the promise and threat of an unanticipatable future. Perhaps in the present context, we should take shibboleth as the artwork of the political concept that is not one. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Minority? Yeah. Minority.
Thank you. That was beautiful. And I think provocatively engaged with, I think, what I'm going to say. So minority. According to Ambedkar's biographer, Jinnah and Ambedkar shook hands that day and belched fire on the Congress. It was...
Microphone.
According to Ambedkar's biographer, Jinnah and Ambedkar shook hands that day and belched fire on the Congress. It was the 22nd of December, 1939, a rally in Bombay's Muhammad Ali Road, where minority opinion had gathered to mark deliverance from provincial Congress ministries that had been in power for 2 years and 3 months, but had resigned to protest India's forced entry into the Second World War.
Yeah, you have to bring the mic very, very close, unfortunately.
Put it closer to your
No, it needs to be closer.
Okay. As Congress began planning the means to demand complete self-rule, Purna Swaraj, as a condition for joining the war effort, the minority questioned Congress's very claim to represent in its thrust to democratic rule. For Ambedkar, the formidable leader of the untouchables, and I'm going to use the word Dalit hereafter, it was not just that the minorities had suffered under Congress rule and that their grievances had to be investigated. The Hindus are a majority, and if we accept the principle of majority rule, they are bound to rule. That being the fundamental premise, the question that arises is whether the Hindus are socially, mentally, and morally fitted for democratic rule. This problem of democracy, given a caste Hindu majority, was an important line of argument in all of Ambedkar's writing. Let me ask the political-minded Hindus, he wrote in Annihilation of Caste, are you fitted for political power even though you do not allow a large class of your own countrymen, like the untouchables, to use public schools? Are you fitted for political power even though you do not allow them to use public wells? Are you fitted for political power even though you do not allow them to use public streets? Are you fitted for political power? And so it goes on. Now, J.J. Priest's book, Minority Rights, is exemplary of a whole array of writing on the minority problem in studies of nationalism and international relations, which considers the minority not as a problem of inferior numeric status, but rather that of political outsiders. Now, the range of meanings that the OED offers supports this distinction from a purely numeric or census understanding of the word minority, but not from the relational inequality it represents. Subdivision, inferior, subordinate, have to contend with a small group, smaller, the smaller number or part, a number which is less than half the whole number. However, this smallness does not render minority subordinate in significance. It is not a minor problem. As Priest notes, the minority as problem has constituted an ongoing friction between states, a pretext for separatism, irredentism, intervention, and a direct and indirect cause of local and general wars. Indeed, it is from this inseparable smallness of minority that Arjun Appadurai argues in The Fear of Small Numbers that the inner reciprocity of majorities and minorities in liberal social thought produces an anxiety of incompleteness. Minorities and their small numbers remind these majorities of the small gap which lies between their condition as majorities and the horizon of an unsullied national whole. And this sense of incompleteness, Appadurai goes on, can drive majorities into paroxysms of violence against minorities. Now, there's an implication here, in other words, that minorities are the very cause, in this sense, responsible for the anxiety that makes majorities predatory and ethnocidal. Now, this conception of minority as problem then requires solutions, special rights, safeguards, partitions, transfers of population, or as incompleteness begets violence, ghettoization, pogroms, ethnocide. Priest goes so far as to say that there are no perfect solutions to the minority problem. But can one think of minority outside this condition of problem and incompleteness? Can one think of minority instead as belching fire, as a condition of dissent, with insurrectionary, insurgent possibilities to transform the whole? Now, here I take inspiration from Pariah, which is a South Indian Dalit caste name that entered English first as the pariah problem to displace, obfuscate the servitude of Dalit unfree labor, conditions of slavery in India, on the very eve of abolition of slavery across the empire. And then, of course, as pariah people, a la Weber, to stigmatize Jews in Europe. Arendt's appropriation of stigma into a conscious pariah condition with a special capacity for humanity that didn't obscure, but rather brought acute attention to structures of privilege and prejudice, is that kind of rethinking that minority arguably deserves as well. Thus, in this, if I may say, Arendtian spirit, that I turn to two texts by Ambedkar, one, The Annihilation of Caste, that I just mentioned, and the other, Thoughts on Pakistan. Annihilation of Caste was written originally as a speech in 1936, but which Ambedkar was not allowed to deliver, where he argued that the destruction of caste required the destruction of the very religion it was based on. He published the speech along with the correspondence that surrounded it, including an important exchange with Gandhi. Ambedkar wrote Thoughts on Pakistan in the months following the Pakistan Resolution, which was passed by the Muslim League on 23rd March 1940, which made the claim that Muslims were no longer a minority, but rather a separate nation that deserves separate states. Ambedkar's detailed 500-page argument fiercely supported a partition based on his analysis of the League's claim to nation. The two texts have rarely been regarded together, and in the one instance when they have been, the historian Ashwari Kumar calls the former insurrectionary Annihilation of Caste as insurrectionary, and the latter, Thoughts on Pakistan, inflammatory. I want to suggest that insurrectionary and inflammatory represent a continuum that can elucidate the possibilities and limits of minority as dissent, and the inseparable question of force with it. Can one think of minority of dissent in its, certainly one can think of a minority of dissent in its constitutional or legal sense as a mere difference of opinion or dissent can carry force, can require force, can become incitement, insurgent, insurrectionary, possibly transform the majority. Now, much writing on minority turns to the interwar period of European history, the collapse of multi-ethnic empires and the formation of nation-states in a belt of mixed populations in the East, mediated by the League of Nations minority treaties. Arendt makes a suggestion more by way of footnote, whether one might consider the imposition of the minority treaties, which the League of Nations as an external guarantor of minority rights, as an introduction of colonial methods into European affairs. Indeed, the emergence of representative political institutions in colonial India came with protections for a minority against a majority in the form of separate electorates for Muslims in 1909. Thus, minority privileges guaranteed by colonial form of power and understood as such as an unwelcome colonial imposition on the majority and albatross around its neck. Separate electorates were extended to Sikhs in 1919, but the real confrontation around extending separate electorates to all minorities, including Dalits, took place between Ambedkar and Gandhi in 1932, just prior to the elections that would bring the Congress ministries to power in the provincial governments of India. Much has been written about this confrontation between Ambedkar and Gandhi, as Gandhi undertook a fast unto death to force Ambedkar to relinquish this hard-won minority right, because it meant the recognition of Dalits as a minority outside the Hindu majority fold. Instead, Gandhi insisted on joint electorates with reservations for Dalits as a way to keep Dalits a minority within and not outside the majority. What is remarkable about Ambedkar's submission to the Mahatma is his stubborn refusal to obediently accept this forced subordinate inclusion into the majority. He gave expression to his disobedience of spirit by speaking and writing about this epic encounter with bitterness right to the end of his life, and by announcing his intention to convert almost immediately thereafter, born a Dalit but will not die one. By raising the spectral threat of converting out of the majority, he only actually converted months before he died. Ambedkar retained in minority, even as a minority force within a majority, a fierce autonomy and insistence on its force of dissent. I want to say Gandhi recognized Ambedkar's commitment to minority as a dissenting moral force to be reckoned with when he criticized the Organization for the Destruction of Caste, the Jatpat Todak Mandal, which had invited Ambedkar initially to give his speech, for not allowing Ambedkar to deliver annihilation of caste, particularly, and this is what Gandhi wrote, as a representative of a very small minority. But what was Gandhi holding out to Ambedkar by way of inclusion into the power of the majority? Was it the promise of assimilation as a form of inclusion that the minority treaties had taken away from minorities of the new Eastern European nation states? Gandhi was utterly opposed to untouchability, but unlike the Jatpat Todak Mandal that had invited Ambedkar, he believed Hinduism to be a vital spiritual inheritance secured through a non-hierarchical understanding of caste as Varna or ancestral calling, which he understood as having a very important role to play as resilience and social stability, giving resilience and social stability to Hinduism over the centuries. Now, Ambedkar rejected Varna outright as bearing little difference from caste, but his reasons to reject inclusion can also be understood as obfuscating the relational inequality evident in minority. And second, for proposing an inadequate theory of social change which would leave Dalits bereft of minorities' insurgent possibilities. Here, the word assimilation is helpful to think with. Once considered a desirable process to make national wholes, we don't use the word anymore in relation to minorities. But for Arendt, writing in the 1950s, she had to work with the promise of assimilation in the European context in order to declare it a false possibility, a disguise of stigma. However, it's noteworthy that the word is almost entirely absent in Indian political discourse, even at this time. Why is this the case? In a society where the majority is distinguished by caste, assimilation is an impossibility. You can have Brahmanization, Sanskritization, and conversion, and they all elicit a lot of conversation. But minority then emerges as a critical register for the unassimilable and irreducible nature of difference. Toleration, on the other hand, in the Indian context, is the operative term. Faisal Devji calls this the neighborly practice of prejudice, as in Gandhi's thought, whereby unassimilable minorities and majorities can live together as a social and political whole. Thus, Ambedkar's attack on the virtues of toleration is important. He discusses it in the main text of Annihilation of Caste and in his response to Gandhi. He argues that the Hindus claim to be a tolerant people, and this is based on their ability to worship multiple and antagonistic gods and goddesses at the same time. But he argues they are not tolerant. This spirit of toleration, instead, merely conceals that they are too weak to oppose or too indifferent to oppose when they know a structure to be unjust, or they are simply dishonest. For Ambedkar, the idea that society can be made tolerable and even happy without any fundamental change in its structure is utterly unacceptable. He writes, "To a slave, his master may be better or worse, but there cannot be a good master. A good man cannot be a master, and a master cannot be a good man." This reminds me of Wendy Brown's work on tolerance as a discourse of power that has decidedly depoliticizing effects, and as she argues, plays an important role in the continuous production of structural inequality, stabilizing inequality between those being tolerated and those tolerating. For Ambedkar, instead of toleration, it is annihilation that Ambedkar demands, and it carries this insurrectionary force of his minority position. A complete change in the fundamental notions of life cannot take place without annihilation. In its full theological sense, the destruction of body and soul and obliteration. The old body must die before a new body can come into existence. A new old life must end for a new life to enter into it. He inserts the word conversion here to be provocative given his prior announcement to convert, but he uses it to reiterate a change in outlook or new life. However, the distinction is important. Through both annihilation and conversion, Ambedkar could cease to be a Dalit, but it is only through annihilation that he could cease to be a minority. Annihilation would obliterate the Dalit minority, Hindu majority distinction, while conversion, as he was well aware, would give him a way out of subordination with the Hindu majority, but leave him a minority, and perhaps more poignantly, leave the structural unequal of the minority-majority intact. Annihilation, however, required extraordinary force. How was such force to be cultivated, acquired, mobilized? Here, Gandhi as foil is useful. Ambedkar considered Gandhi's virtuous commitment to ancestral calling as a denial to Dalits of two particular possibilities. One, it denied them the opportunity to acquire knowledge, and second, it emasculated them by denying them the right to be armed. The significance of the denial to knowledge is self-evident. In order for Dalits as minority to descend, they need independent thinking that puts some portion of an apparently stable world in peril. But it also needs courage and daring to act in accordance with their thinking. I'm quoting from Annihilation of Caste. You must take the stand that Buddha took, Ambedkar writes. You must not only discard the Shastras, you must deny their authority, as did Buddha and Nanak. You must have the courage to tell the Hindus that what is wrong with them is their religion, which has produced in them this notion of the sacredness of caste. Will you show that courage? Now, the relationship to courage, of courage to bearing arms, to have actual fighting experience in order to be able to fight for ideas, is a theme that runs across the gamut of Indian Hindu thought in the colonial context. Uday Singh Mehta's political concept for violence, for instance, explores Gandhi's commitment to recruiting soldiers for the First World War in terms of this relationship of violence to nonviolence. Nonviolence could not be a passive, inactive state. It required fearlessness, courage, and it required an active choice to be made. Fighting for your life as a soldier cultivated that courage, and once the capacity for violence had been acquired, it made the choice to be nonviolent a meaningful one. For Ambedkar, the son of a Mahar soldier, the importance of participation of Dalits in the British Indian Army cannot be underestimated, both as a transgression of caste occupational taboos, but also, as with Gandhi, for the cultivation of a fighting spirit. It is here in Thoughts on Pakistan that then the Muslim emerges as the paradigmatic insurrectionary minority, and where minority and the force of dissent can be explored at its limits. Now, this text, its arguments are forged from an amalgamation of Orientalist scholarship, the political science of his time, and hard statistical data, and he actually has large passages from a lot of different Orientalist political science texts of his time included in the main body of this book. So it's important to understand that Ambedkar's arguments for the Muslim insurrectionary minority are predicated on two colonial concepts, one which Ambedkar reinforces and the other which he dismantles, and as I hope will be self-evident, he does so intentionally. The first is the profoundly Orientalist conception of Islam as a religion of the sword, and thus the text begins with and is rife with a litany of Muslim invasions, temple destructions, and brutal forms of subjugation. But the goal of brute Muslim force is not to conquer territory or accumulation of wealth, but rather to destroy the Hindu faith. And he repeats this several times in the book. A goal, one may argue, he is not opposed to when it's read alongside annihilation of caste, albeit for different reasons. The second colonial concept at work, which Ambedkar challenges, is the idea of martial and non-martial races. The colonial state divided Indian subjects into martial and non-martial classes after the revolt of 1857, which was led by mutineering sepoys of the Bengal regiments. Those considered martial races were those of the Punjab, Northwest Frontier, and Kashmir. And according to Ambedkar's carefully culled statistics, colonial military records at this time were classified. Recruits from these regions accounted for nearly 60% of the British Indian Army, with, for instance, all of South India accounting for only 5%. All three high recruitment regions had Muslim majority populations. And as a result, Muslims themselves accounted for 34% of the army, higher than their numbers in the population at large. The martial races, looked upon as a tower of strength, as Ambedkar states, he was as artificial as the Hindu theory of caste. Thus, although Ambedkar considered the fighting spirit as a natural endowment of the Muslims in India, he also considered it as a historically cultivated and cultivatable attribute. The Hindu spirit of aggression is a new phase which he has just begun to cultivate. The Muslim spirit of aggression is his native endowment and is ancient as compared with that of the Hindus. It is not that the Hindu, if given time, will not pick up and overtake the Muslim, but as matters stand today, the Muslim, in his exhibition of the spirit of aggression, leaves the Hindu far behind. If one thinks of Ambedkar's critique of toleration in Annihilation of Caste as a symptom of weakness, indifference, and dishonesty, and annihilation as independent thinking mounted by courage, then this Muslim spirit of aggression had the potential to make them the vanguard of minority of dissent. He goes on, even as Muslims have since then been subjugated by the British and have become a subject minority, they refuse to be subjugated. Pages upon pages, Ambedkar explores Islamic concepts of jihad and hijrah to resist, wage holy war, or migrate from what they perceive to be oppressive or unjust conditions under colonial rule. Ambedkar writes, they are more outspoken than the Hindus. They are honest, and they question the use of reverential titles like Mahatma, which he himself does in Annihilation of Caste as well. So it's a reference back, one could say, to in this text as well. Ambedkar's analysis, in Ambedkar's analysis, then, the spirit of aggression has resulted in concrete political consequences for the anti-colonial struggle. He argues it was the Muslim Khilafat movement that launched Gandhi's non-cooperation movement and not the Hindu Congress. It was the Muslim political leadership, Ambedkar argues, in Congress, Muslim League, Jamiat-ul-Ulama Hind, and the Khilafat Committee that pushed for full independence from British rule, or Purna Swaraj, as early as the 1920s, while Gandhi and his followers in Congress insisted on only self-rule within the imperial frame. After pages and pages of, on the details of the political deliberations, Ambedkar concludes, with these facts, who can doubt that the Hindus are for dominion status and the Muslims are for independence? Now, with democratic self-rule on the horizon, the Muslim minority cannot be, he argues, excluded from political power and become a subject race. In pages after pages, he repeats this: the Muslims and other minorities are not prepared to accept the position of subject races. Are Hindus to be a ruling race and the Muslims and other minorities to be subject races under Swaraj? It is precisely at the moment when Muslims relinquish their status as minority, will themselves a nation, as he puts it, and choose a separate destiny, that Ambedkar's text explodes with the minority right to insurrection. He draws upon Henry Sidgwick's Elements of Politics to make his argument, and he reproduces the entire passages from this text, that insurrection is preferable to submission, for insurrection can induce redress of grievance. It may bring home to the majority the intensity of the sense of injury. This right of insurrection is a salutary check on the supreme power. goes on, a moral right of insurrection must be held to exist in the most popularly governed community. So he keeps repeating from Sidgwick's text this moral right of insurrection that must be maintained. Although Sidgwick goes on to argue that the minority's ultimate insurrectionary right includes the right to secede, become a nation, and form a new state, for Ambedkar, it is the claim to nation that takes away the right to insurrection, and its force of dissent becomes mere disruption. Thus, when Ambedkar dogmatically supports Muslim claim to nation, Muslims are politically detachable, spiritually alien, irreconcilable, etc., he is in effect taking away their right to insurrection. And that same spirit of aggression becomes a threat that requires a limit. Ambedkar's text is replete with sufficient fear and revulsion for Faisal Devji to call this text by Ambedkar an anti-Muslim text. Here are the limits of minorities' dissenting force. Muslims are the paradigmatic insurrectionary minority, a status that Muslims lose when they declare themselves a nation, a status they must lose as they are a nation. For Muslims bear the unforgivable stigma of being a minority that once ruled India. For a minority to have aspirations of power, to have been rulers, was acceptable in the age of empire. It is utterly unacceptable, illegitimate in the age of democratic nationalism. Much of the revulsion accumulated against Muslim history in India has been fashioned and mobilized for the age of democratic nationalism. A minority cannot rule in a democracy. That's Ambedkar. In many respects, both Annihilation of Caste and Thoughts on Pakistan are militant texts in that they are both combative, sometimes to an extreme. They demand and value a minority's necessary disobedience in spirit and action, but not when the minority has sinned to rule. This marks the limit. An almost surprising passage in Thoughts on Pakistan is this. In creating, molding, expanding, and knitting together political communities, what is more important than force? It is obedience. This can only make sense in Ambedkar's thought when a minority does not know its place. Obedience requires such psychological attributes of indifference, deference, sympathy, fear, and reason for a minor section to work under a major section. Such are the demands of democracy. To believe in civil disobedience, Ambedkar writes then, is to believe in anarchy.
Thank you for two wonderful papers that address, I think, two principles of difference and two systems of separations that has resonate in a different way, I think. So I open it for discussion. Yeah.
So the question is for Mark. And so when you were talking about the Wagner piece, I'm not sure whether it's in the Judentum in der Musik that he talks about this or whether it's in a later essay, but he invokes the word Mauschen, and which is extremely difficult to translate. It means sort of murmuring, but at the same time, it's like passing, or it's a way of kind of cheating your way, through the dominant language. And he in fact uses it in that second sense about Jewish music or Jewish culture trying to pass in a dominant culture. So that's sort of one part of this question. And the other was you're citing Twain and his announcement that he's going to be using a variety of, I guess dialects, but I guess also sort of vernacular language, right? So I guess my question is, on the one hand, you have kind of the cheating way of doing this, and on the other side, in the Twain, a kind of citation. So I guess my question is, can, in fact, the shibboleth be quoted or cited?
That last part, I think, is at once easy and difficult. The easy answer is, of course, yes. It's constantly cited, quoted. I mean, one of the leitmotifs of my paper was the sort of proliferation of shibboleth effects, of the shibboleth as a word that has entered into innumerable languages to mean what? To mean shibboleth, except of course that what it means is then other signs that are used always in particular singular situations. The test is a singular moment, you fail it or you pass it, but it's made possible by this iterability, this proliferation. The Twain quotation, I'm not particularly happy about that moment in the paper. I just wanted to register the complex network of linguistic differentiation that I think particularly probably in less in our community, which is so media satirized and normativized, less so in Rhode Island, but perhaps, but still, linguistically, being able to pick someone out in their class position, their locale. This was perhaps more, an effect of speech in previous decades and centuries, and perhaps also is still the case in different contexts, in, for instance, maybe parts of Britain rather than here. So I just wanted to register that and to offer Twain as at least claiming to be able to mimic and to pass in multiple voices, to do the police in different voices.
Isn't that passing the test?
Yes, it is. The point being that you can never be sure that the test will close, will actually work. Because that's part of the knife edge on which I balance in this paper, which I believe is the condition of the shibboleth. It is a very powerful technique, but it is not ever securable. And that's what makes language open.
I guess what I'm asking you is, in fact, the definition of the shibboleth is that you have to fail it. In otherwise, because if you pass it, the difference has been erased. If you fail it, which seems to me a must, that allows for the appearance of difference.
That's correct.
Right.
That is correct. Okay, thank you. That's a really nice point. Yes. There's a proliferation of failure then in that sense.
Exactly.
Thank you. These are wonderful papers, and they worked so beautifully together. And I wanted to ask a question about conceptualization, the place of the concept in both, and in particular, Mark. I mean, my question's probably not primarily for Mark, but nevertheless. Mark, you unpacked the notion of the shibboleth and the relationship of the shibboleth to the concept in a way that I thought was very interesting. In fact, it sort of played out retrospectively through many of the other papers that we've heard, in fact, including Jones' paper on disappearance, which I kind of think is not a concept in the same way that you, I believe, are making a case for shibboleth also not being a concept. And I think the same could be said, actually, of Alex's very interesting notion of strike. I wanted to kind of ask the question, really, though, of Vazira, because I think that minority also is not exactly a concept, or at least it's for Ambedkar, its emergence as a concept is predicated upon its disappearance. It's not workable as a concept. In fact, it needs to be abolished in the same way that caste needs to be abolished, in the same way that Hinduism needs to be annihilated. So the category of minority is in fact only a political concept insofar as it is annihilated. I mean, that's how I would see your paper. So I wondered if you wanted to comment a bit more about that. I guess the place of the concept, which is, Adi's wonderful paper on the concept notwithstanding, I'm sort of beginning to see a kind of a sort of crack. When I did see that piece, Shibboleth, at the Tate Modern, although I'd forgotten it was called Shibboleth because my friend said, let's go and see the crack in the floor of Tate Modern. So, but I'm wondering if there is in fact a crack right the way through the term concept.
You want to start?
I'll basically pass on this one unless it comes back because let Vizira answer, but essentially, yes, that is the argument of my paper, that Shibboleth, as it were, cracks the concept precisely because it is both, as it were, takes you toward mass murder and toward the promise of the other.
Yeah, crack through the concept. I like that. Yes, minority, annihilation of minority as sort of the end, the horizon that Ambedkar is working or thinking towards, is something I've actually tried to think against, because Thoughts on Pakistan is a harsh argument for a particular kind of partition between Muslims and Hindus, in which there is a total transfer of population as well. And it's very political science in that it goes through a whole set of examples from Eastern European events as they have just unfolded or unfolding, to make a kind of case for for the annihilation of minorities, right? So that's the explicit argument of the book. We have to annihilate minorities. They are a problem. This is the way to do it. Pick up people, move them, and cut, crack. So instead of reading it, and it's a text that, inflammatory, anti-Muslim, et cetera, I mean, there's a way in which historians are troubled by it, but it's also a way in which, in the present, it's a text that's being valorized as well as the RSS celebrates this text. The center left of the Indian political spectrum also celebrates this text because of this a clear argument that he puts forward for the unlivability of the Muslim in India. Right, so that would be the most obvious reading of the text, and I've tried to actually read against it and recover from it by reading it along with Annihilation of Caste. In fact, this insurrectionary possibility within it. And I guess I'm driven by the desire to read in Ambedkar that insurrectionary possibility itself, right? So rather than to see him as like aligned with the RSS, right?
Which of course doesn't make any sense.
Which doesn't make any sense, right? So instead of seeing him as aligned with a whole, spectrum of writing that will support much of his argument, Muslims are utterly, are spiritually alien, unlivable, unreconcilable. The litany of words that sear through the text, which make them Muslim an annihilatable category, are don't know, yeah.
So, thank you to both of the papers. I have, I guess, a question for each of you, a question for Mark, anyways, a very brief question. Just why did you choose that translation of the Bible? I was curious about, given the attention to translation in other contexts and the way in which the King raises interesting issues about the King James Version and so forth. And then for the Zira, I was thinking, both of the papers I enjoyed very much. I was really intrigued when you were talking about the kinds of Orientalist assumptions that were operative there and the ways in which Ambedkar is appropriating some and critiquing others. I was thinking about other literature and religious studies that's done a lot to argue that the entire notion of Hinduism is largely as a coherent, relatively discrete, but yet organized entity that we think of as a religious tradition is a product of 19th century, late 18th and 19th century Orientalist discourse. And I was wondering how that figures in, or if it does, either in Ambedkar's own text or in your reading of the text.
Well, thanks. I don't have a good answer, except that some of this paper was put together pretty quickly, and I knew I could read that translation. You know, the sentences are so beautiful, and I do not read Hebrew, and you know, that's, as it were, a structuring embarrassment that frames the talk. That I cannot read the alphabet, the symbols that I nonetheless carefully inserted for those who can. So I don't pass that test.
Yeah, the category of Hinduism at work in the text, as much as the category of Islam at work in these texts, right? So both Hindu and Muslim function, I think, as contingent wholes, bounded categories that I think Ambedkar is self-aware are not. So he says things like, most Muslims in India are converts from caste or Dalit backgrounds. So that explodes the Muslim category as this outsider category, as this distinct kind of minority, right? And for in Annihilation of Caste, for instance, he goes through a whole series of arguments for what is the basis of untouchability, to come to the conclusion that untouchability is fundamentally in the sacred text, sanctioned by the sacred text, and that's the problem, not any of the other ways in which untouchability is being conceived of. So it is from the category of untouchability that, in a way, he is deploying both Hindu and Muslim, right? And pitting them against each other and thinking through them at the same time.
My question, I think, is really for Tim, but I welcome Mark and Zira's and anyone else's reaction to it. What does it mean when we declare that minority or strike is not a concept? I mean, I can see the headline, Conference at Brown declares strike not a concept. What practical action would we be able to take on that knowledge or that perception? I mean, once we've done what has been done with these terms here, I don't mean to say all we can do is restabilize them, but what consequence, what effect does our use of the term concept, our wielding of the term concept have with respect to these nodal points of discourse? Oh, I'm not sharing, so I think Mark.
I'll answer very quickly, because since the question of concept comes back, I'll try to be more, as it were, serious about it or full. give you a fuller answer. The whole point of the shibboleth is that it doesn't help you to know the concept because knowledge is not involved, performance is involved. Sorry. Part of the complexity of the non-conceptuality of the shibboleth is because it names the split between knowledge or conceptuality and performance. You can have a very clear concept of the shibboleth, but the test of the shibboleth doesn't matter for that. So what do you do is the question you ask, and the shibboleth test suggests you won't ever be sure.
Keep failing.
Keep failing.
Thank you.
Kim?
Well, the reason I asked the question, I think, was because it was actually, I was intrigued about something that I wasn't able to ask Alex earlier, but it's the place of strike. The strike, in your analysis, in particular, as a sort of mode of exception within what I took you to be analyzing a kind of, a discourse, in fact, and the discourse of liberalism. And it seemed to me that when you ended up in your talk elaborating the kind of aporia that the strike actually occupies within the discourse of liberalism, that the strike is a kind of exception, in meaning that that it has a certain place of exceptionality within discourse. So I thought that it was about time that we started, not about time that we started, but that this panel was an opportunity to start to talk about language and discourse in a way that hadn't quite been made possible up until now. So that's why I asked the question about the uneasy or the unstable relationship to the concept of both of your papers, which I thought was very productive.
I would like to interfere now here at this point regarding the crack in the concept. Why is it so problematic? I mean, if there were not a crack, we should have worried. No? Here's the concept. Take it or leave it. This is frightening. This is one thing. And the other is we can understand the crack or the impossibility of completing the work of conceptualization only if we try, only if we conceptualize, only if we perform the concept. And so it's, in this sense, the concept is different than just a speech like excuse me or there or something like this. These are not concepts. So if we just get rid of this fossilized image of the concept as something stable, then we can go on playing without worries.
I wanted to suggest that there's a connection, because there's the possibility of the non-performance, a strike against the shibboleth. You know the concept of the distinction exists. You refuse to perform, whatever the consequences may be. So there seems to me to be a possible connection there. In other words, this refusal or this strike makes the conceptual distinction available in a strange way.
Just a short comment or question, I don't know exactly. I think that you are talking about two different performances. I think that you talked about the performance, or you talked about the performance of the one who is required to say shibboleth, and you're speaking also about the performance of the concept, or Adi speaks about the performance of the concept. So I think that there are different levels of performance here, but I would like to ask you, Mark, actually, what you said about the shibboleth is that the use of the of the word became its meaning when the word migrated to other languages, when it was uprooted, or not uprooted, but just displaced from its native languages. So actually, it's the use that becomes the meaning. And I try to think about it during your talk, if there are other words that their meaning is their use and not their performance, because I'm not speaking about the way that people were obliged to perform. So if you have any idea, if you have in mind other words that their meaning is their use? Yeah, what it is, yeah. Thank you. And
No.
just
My-
parenthesis, you said that this is considered to be the first work that cracked the floor of an institution, and of course there is Hans Hacke in the Venice Biennale cracking the Germany pavilion.
Oh, wonderful.
So
See, I
just
need
as a
to,
reference. It's 1990 something.
I need to talk with you before. Yeah, just very, the only thing I would say is that if you think of the shibboleth as a concept, it's the concept of a performance that is not conceptual. And that's the key thing, right? A shibboleth has to set a test that can't simply be performed at will. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. So that's what's interesting about it as a concept, right?
Rosira, I would like to ask you about minority. If I understood you right,
Speak into the mic.
if I understood you correctly, whether we get rid or completely assimilate, it doesn't matter for my question, the minority, whether it's the untouchable or the Muslims or any other group. So there's no more minority in this sense. But soon thereafter, there will be another one. So why this destructive or annihilating moment is about a particular minority? It doesn't guarantee the disappearance of the possibility of a minority, another minority, to be a minority.
Right.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, so when I think of what the work of annihilation is in Ambedkar's thinking, I don't think of it as it being about the possibility of minority being annihilated, but rather I think of annihilation as an impossible horizon in his writing. For instance, as he's writing Annihilation of Caste, he has already announced he's going to convert out, right? So in that gesture, one can think of it as saying, I make that argument for the annihilation as a sort of for moving force in a certain direction, but I don't think it's going to actually achieve its horizon. So the move to convert then is that of maintaining his own status as minority, right? So, which is why I thought of that as an important gesture of him launching this argument to annihilate caste, and at the same time of insisting on remaining a minority. And if one reads that alongside his other texts in which he is arguing for the annihilation of minorities, it is it could be read in that same spirit of it not, in fact, he's making that argument, but without the desire to achieve that horizon, without necessarily thinking that the horizon will be achieved. So that you always have, you need to keep the minority as an insurgent possibility. That minority is an essential category rather than one to be, done away with. I don't know. Yeah. So I don't think of him as, I think of him as holding on to minority as a set of possibilities.
Guys, the possibility.
Even,
Holding on to a minority, I mean, this is as a task, implies the possibility or the prospect of abolishing the minority, abolishing the relationship between majority and minority. And I wonder where this comes from.
abolishing the relationship between minority and majority.
Otherwise, why should we worry about it? I mean, there would always be a minority. The majority will take care of it.
Yes. So, okay. So what I want to say is that he in fact doesn't want to annihilate the minority, right? So to keep. So I'm not sure if. So keeping the minority alongside the majority. Right? The majority may try to annihilate the minority. It may do so by a number of different means. But the insistence on minority then is an insistence of a certain kind of dissent that needs to be part of the whole. No, I didn't.
Yes.
Just a tiny follow-up, because I'm finding this quite fascinating. I'm wondering, Vazira, whether one of the things that happens through your thinking and through your sort of forced thinking of these two texts together that so resist that kind of reading, whether one of the things that happens is that by the end one gets to a place where one can think of Ambedkar and Gandhi, in fact, strangely committed as if from two opposite sides to the insurrectional potential of minority, and through something that one could call becoming minority, but surely conceptualized in that sense, it would have been recognized by neither one, but perhaps that would allow us to think where they are were in fact tragically similar. And I say tragically because it could not have been recognized as a similar commitment, but in fact as opposite ones. Yeah. Is that one possible case?
I like thinking about it as a becoming minority, as a sort of a generative process that's really integral to Ambedkar's thinking as well as Gandhi's. And I guess the unsaid part of this exercise for me was the lament at this will to nation, right? So this will to nation is a will that, a willing or becoming that I wanted to put Ambedkar's thought against, and so that's the concept that I wanted to crack in a way by thinking about the integral capacity, the possibilities of minority. So it's so the giving up being minority is a problem. And so, yeah.
I have a question for Mark. So I'm not sure this is right, and I'm not sure I understand the question, but I'll try to ask it. So maybe this is incorrect, but it seemed to me like one way to think about what you're up to in the paper is to think about what you might describe as the epistemology of the shibboleth. And I'm curious what might happen if we think instead about the ontology. So it struck me that a lot of the racial theory that you're drawing on, Gobineau, as well as that which is articulated in Schmidt and Wagner, is a kind of typological understanding of racial types, or a kind of a very right. So that there's different groups, and there's that they're kind of essentially distinct, right? And that for that reason there is no ambiguity about how we distinguish one from another. I'm curious about. There's of course many other ways of thinking about human diversity. One can think in population terms, which is how biologists and linguists tend to think in the 20th, further into the 20th century, where there's a great deal of variation within populations as well as between populations. And so you seem very interested in the kind of the importance of failure and the difficulty of, the important role that failure plays in the shibboleth test. But it seemed to me that passing the test is just as difficult or just as complicated if we think in more population terms. It's not clear what it would mean to pass the test, because it's not as though there's one way that all kind of competent speakers of a language speak that language in the same way. In fact, there's a great deal of variation, or you might think there's a great deal of variation in the way languages are spoken.
Thanks, Lucas. I have to say at this point, my brain is a desert. And it's just, everything has disappeared, and it's on strike. So I'll see what I can do. I'm interested in linguistic performance and in the tension between linguistic performance and linguistic meaning. And I'm interested in these intensely anxious racial theories of the 19th century, because they are so interested in language and in finding a more secure shibboleth than that than that which language offers. So hence you get these hyperbolic claims that even if you're a native speaker, if you're a Jew or if you're whatever, the outsider being targeted, you still can be heard as foreign. It's absurd, right? But that doesn't. But the rhetorical need for that gesture, is what I'm seeking to put into touch with my deconstructive sense of the ultimate uninsurability of linguistic borders. So the shibboleth, as Suzanne was pressing me a few minutes ago, indeed it becomes visible only when you fail it, as it were, right? Otherwise, if everybody passes the shibboleth test in a way, there's no shibboleth. Well, it does, there is none, as it were. But it also will never. It can never entirely guarantee its performance, precisely because it's not a conceptual performance. So that cuts both ways. You can't study for it. That's the whole point. Otherwise, a spy could, or an actor could just, whatever. Ephraimite just studies a bit and then goes over the border. You can't study for it, but it doesn't mean that you are that it's a guaranteeable technology. So when you have hyperbolic desire to expel, as it were, a parasite that is within the body politic, as in the rhetoric of 19th century racism, language no longer suffices, and you have this hyperbolic rhetoric of the body. That's what I'm interested in. So you're right, that kind of racism draws on typological a typological tradition, in fact, a typology. Yeah.
I think the desert is blooming.
I'm tired too, so I hope I'm going to make sense here. But it's really fascinating listening to your talk and looking at the language that you put up there on the screen. Because anyone can do this, but I mean, going back and reading some of the early Zionists, I became very fascinated with Vladimir Jabotinsky, who was a right-wing Zionist. And it's really interesting to go back and read him. First of all, he was multilingual, and of course, for that, and he was multilingual, but he ultimately wanted to build a Jewish state in which there was only one language. He also lamented his inability to sort of stack up to the Russians who use the Russian language, because he said no matter how good we are as Jews in using this language, we're always seen as being sort of artificial. And then Isaiah Berlin also goes further and says, in fact, to use the language too well that's what marks us, because we are then seen to be not really native. We're too good at the structures. But what's interesting about, especially Jabotinsky, given what happened to him, is that he wanted very much to be, I mean, he's a universalist in many ways at the beginning of his young adult life, and he also wanted to be taken seriously as a writer of Russian, a speaker of Russian, and so on, and felt that this was just, no one will, in the end, will ever accept him or any other Jew. And of course, that's what motivates him to then become a majority people, who then the same thing will then be perpetuated, but with his language as the dominant language. So, and the other kind of anecdote I just thought of when you were speaking is that I was in Sarajevo a number of years ago now, and this fellow who was there and had gone through the horrors of 1991, 92, was talking about language and the Bosnian, Bosnia and the sort of split between Bosnians and Serbs. And he said, I said, well, what was it, a language? Did you use a different language? He said, no, the language was the same. Now we use a different language. Or we had the same language, but after the war, there was really an attempt on both sides to begin to create just enough difference in the words that we could say that it was, the language difference was part of the foundation for our essential difference. So it's really, very interesting, very interesting paper. And the two papers worked very well together, I thought, too, actually, in all sorts of ways. So,
Can I suggest what?
Two more things about,
Okay.
two things about shibboleth. One is that I do shibboleth tests, many of us do shibboleth tests every day if we happen to have on our login pages on our computers, I don't know if they care about passwords, so we're doing shibboleth tests, and we usually pass them, but we don't have to speak them. So it seems to me it's this odd sort of notion, which is probably true. Secondly, on Wagner's anxieties that seem to be coming through there is that interesting passage in Adorno's book on Wagner where he talks about how Wagner puts in is writing a description of Mima, who is obviously the Jew figure in Siegfried. And there's one point where apparently in an early draft he actually has a description of what Mima should look like, and the description looks like a description of Wagner, and then he takes it out as if he sort of betrayed himself as not passing. So it's a very sick man. Wagner, not Adorno. Maybe it's sick too.
I would have to argue, though, that CAPTCHA and shibboleth just seem to me totally different categories of identification. So the CAPTCHA that you're attempting to pass when you're presenting as human to a robot, essentially, proving yourself human to a robot, is not a linguistic act. In the same way, it doesn't even have to be a word. It can be, a non-language, and often is. And is now no longer even going to be written language. Probably will be the movement of the mouse. So it seems to me like a very, very different category. Just aside.
Thank you. It was wonderful.